At my daughter-in-law's party, she raised her glass and called me a freeloader. My son stood right next to her and didn't say a single word. 20 guests stared at me. A few even laughed. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "Enjoy this house while it still feels like yours." The next morning, their cards were declined, their luxury SUV was being towed, and the blue folder on my desk proved only one thing: I had never been living off of them. They had been living off of me. This is my mother-in-law, Eleanor. She's a freeloader who lives under our roof, eats our food, and contributes nothing. Those words cut through the warm air of the living room like a serrated blade. Claire spoke them with a casual cruelty while showing off their brand new, obscenely expensive sunroom to the guests. 20 people. Neighbors. My son Julian's colleagues and Claire's new superficial social circle went dead silent. The quiet was so heavy, you could hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock. They looked at me, some with blatant pity, others with that smug curiosity people have when they feel superior to someone else's misfortune. I felt their eyes burning into me, but I didn't drop my fine china teacup. My hand stayed steady, my back stayed straight. At 65, I've lived through enough Connecticut winters to know that when the frost hits, you don't shiver, you just button your coat tighter. In a moment like that, emotion is a luxury I couldn't afford. Claire stood there in her designer dress, the chandelier light dancing in her champagne flute. She was relishing the attention she'd bought by tearing me down. My son Julian stood beside her, staring intently at his wine glass. He looked paralyzed, a man sacrificing his own mother for a moment of peace with his overbearing wife. He didn't say a word. He let the lie hang in the room as if it were the gospel truth. I set the cup down on the saucer with a precise, silent motion. I looked Claire straight in the eye. In that moment, all she saw was an old woman in a gray cardigan, but she had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. "Congratulations on this beautiful home, Claire. Enjoy the glitter while it's still real," I said, my voice as matter-of-fact as a weather report. I stood up without rushing and walked away from the party. I didn't go upstairs to cry. I got into my old sedan and drove into town. The game had officially begun. My small office downtown smelled like old paper and fresh coffee. The streetlights cast grid-like shadows across my desk. In front of me lay the blue ledger folder, the result of 2 years of quiet detective work. Claire thought I was a relic of the past, a woman only good for dusting shelves and watching the grandkids. She had completely forgotten that for 30 years I ran the books for my husband's engineering firm. I knew every metric, every line item, and most importantly, every red flag of a looming bankruptcy. When Julian and Claire bought this house in the suburbs of New York, they had overextended themselves to the breaking point. They wanted the American dream, but they wanted it right now without the years of saving. At the time, I had given them $150,000 in cash for the down payment. Julian called it an early inheritance, but I insisted on a written loan agreement. I told them with a smile it was just a formality. In reality, it was my insurance policy. Over the last few months, Claire had maintained a lifestyle that far outpaced Julian's salary as a department manager. New leases on SUVs, custom furniture, and exclusive club memberships. They had ignored the monthly installments and let the late notices disappear into the recycling bin unopened. What they didn't know was that I had quietly started buying up their debt. In this part of the state, local banks and credit agencies work closely together. When a widow with an impeccable reputation and a solid stock portfolio offers to take over non-performing loans, they don't ask questions. They're just happy to get the risk off their books. I flipped through the documents. I now held the liens on their car, the financing contracts for the kitchen, and most importantly, the deed of trust from the primary bank. Technically speaking, I owned almost everything Claire had just so proudly shown to her guests. I turned off the computer and felt a deep, cold calm. Claire had called me a burden. Tomorrow she would find out exactly how heavy that burden could press when the support was pulled away. On Monday morning, I returned right in time for breakfast. The remains of the party were everywhere. Empty bottles and dirty glasses cluttered the counters. Claire sat at the dining table, her hair a mess, tapping irritably on her tablet. When I walked into the kitchen, she didn't even look up. "About time you got back. Clean up this disaster. I have my yoga group coming over this afternoon and I need fresh juice." She barked in that bossy tone she'd perfected lately. I ignored the order and sat down directly across from her. I placed a simple white envelope on the table. "That's not going to happen today, Claire," I said calmly. She let out a short, dry laugh. "What do you mean, not going to happen? Are you getting defiant now? Don't forget who's providing the roof over your head." I slid the contents of the envelope toward her. They were copies of the assigned loan agreements and a breakdown of their monthly fixed costs, which I had been discreetly covering from my own account until now. "As of today, I am stopping all supplemental payments. Your personal account is overdrawn and Julian's salary has already been garnished, which he probably hasn't told you." Claire's face went pale instantly. She stared at the numbers that proved in black and white that her luxury life was a house of cards built on my savings. Julian walked into the kitchen at that moment. He looked terrible with deep, dark circles under his eyes. He saw the envelope and knew immediately that the time for secrets was over. "Mom, please, we can explain," he stammered. I looked at him, my only son, and felt a painful pang of pity, but I stayed firm. "There's nothing to explain, Julian. I've been subsidizing you for 2 years while being insulted to my face. That ends now." I pulled out a new set of keys. I had the locks on the wine cellar and the pantry for the high-end groceries changed this morning. Since I paid the bills for them, I consider them my property. You have access to the basics, nothing more. Claire jumped up, her voice screeching with rage. "This is illegal. You can't lock us out in our own house." I stood up as well, calm and composed. "It's my money, Claire, and if the first mortgage payment isn't in my account by Friday, I will exercise my rights as the primary creditor and initiate foreclosure. Good luck with yoga." Tuesday passed in an eerie silence. Claire tried to ignore me at first, but reality caught up to her faster than she expected. When she tried to order new clothes online at noon, her credit card was declined. I had canceled the secondary card that ran through my account. A little later, the car leasing company called because the payment for the month had bounced. Julian sat in the living room staring at a stack of unopened mail. He seemed completely paralyzed. I, on the other hand, made myself a simple but nutritious lunch in the kitchen just for one. "How can you be so cruel?" Julian asked me that afternoon while I was pruning my roses in the garden. He didn't sound angry, just desperate. "I'm not being cruel, Julian. I'm being consistent," I replied without stopping my work. "What was cruel was watching Claire humiliate me in front of your friends without saying a word. What was cruel was squandering your father's legacy on status symbols you couldn't afford. I'm just teaching you what it means to be an adult. You can only spend the money you've actually earned." Claire came running out of the house, frantic. She had tried to call her parents to borrow money, but they had shut her down. In her family, pride meant more than loyalty. "We'll sell the house," she screamed at me. "Then we'll get our money back, and you can find somewhere else to go." I didn't laugh, even though I wanted to. "To sell the house, you need my consent. as the primary lien holder. And the current market value will barely cover the debt you've racked up. You'd walk away with nothing. I watched as that thought sank in. The idea of losing everything, the status, the security, the beautiful house was worse than death to her. She was like a predator backed into a corner, but she had no claws left. I had flipped the financial food chain. I was no longer the tolerated grandmother. I was the manager of their destiny. Think carefully about how you treat me from now on, I said pleasantly. I'm the only one who can keep the repo man away. I went back into the house and locked the door behind me. On Wednesday morning, I continued my plan for rearranging the house. Since I was effectively the co-owner and was paying the overhead, I claimed the first floor for myself. I had my furniture brought up from storage and set up in the large living room. Claire watched in disbelief as her minimalist designer pieces were pushed into the corner. "What are you doing?" "This is my living room," she shrieked. I didn't even answer. I just kept directing the movers. Once the first floor was set up to my liking, it felt like a home for the first time in years. I informed Julian and Claire that they would be restricted to the upper floor from now on. "You have your bedroom and a bathroom up there. The kitchen and the living room down here are my area now. If you want to use them, my rules apply. Cleanliness, quiet, and respect," I explained. It was a drastic measure, but necessary to rebuild the boundaries they had so flippantly torn down. Claire tried to protest, but Julian held her back. He had finally realized that any resistance only made their situation worse. I also switched over the internet and cable service. The contracts were in my name. I changed the passwords. Suddenly, they were sitting upstairs in total silence. No Netflix, no Instagram, no distractions from their own misery. Claire came down after 2 hours, looking almost broken. "I need the internet for my work," she said through gritted teeth. "Then you'll have to contribute to the cost," I countered. "And since you currently have no income, I suggest you find a job. The department store at the mall is looking for seasonal help for the holidays." She looked at me as if I'd suggested she work in a coal mine. A woman like her in the stockroom of a Macy's. But she had no choice. Her phone provider had already threatened to cut off her service. That night, I heard them arguing upstairs. It wasn't a triumphant moment for me. It was a sad confirmation. They had built their relationship on material appearances, and now that the facade was crumbling, only bitterness remained. I meanwhile sat in my comfortable armchair, read a book, and enjoyed the peace I had bought so dearly. Thursday marked a turning point. Claire had actually gone to the interview at the department store. She came back late in the afternoon, her expensive heels dusty, looking exhausted. "I got the job," she said lifelessly to Julian in the kitchen. "I start tomorrow, in receiving, lugging boxes." Julian tried to comfort her, but she pushed him away. She blamed him for everything. He was the failure who didn't earn enough to provide her with that life. It was painful to watch, but it was the truth of their marriage. I sat at the kitchen table sorting my mail. "It's honest work, Claire," I chimed in. "In this country, you don't get embarrassed by work. You get embarrassed by debts you don't pay." She didn't give me a glance, but she didn't argue either. The power of reality had broken her pride. I noticed the dynamic in the house changing. Julian started helping with chores without me having to ask. He fixed the dripping faucet in the bathroom and took out the trash. He sought out my company, perhaps hoping for forgiveness or just a piece of normalcy. I remained distant, however. Forgiveness has to be earned. It's not just handed out. I reminded them that the first debt repayment was due on Friday. "Where are we supposed to get the money?" Julian asked desperately. I already spent my paycheck for the month on the most urgent bills. I looked at him. You have things you can sell. Your watch collection, Julian. And Claire's designer bags. There are plenty of sites for secondhand luxury goods. If you list them tonight, you'll have the money by next week. Claire didn't scream this time. She went upstairs silently and returned a little later with 3 boxes full of bags and accessories. It was like she was packing her identity into cardboard boxes. Julian fetched his watch box from the safe. They spent the whole evening at the dining table photographing their treasures. It was a sad sight, but a necessary process of purging. They had to learn that objects have no value if they don't truly belong to you. I brewed a pot of tea and set it silently on the table, a small sign that I didn't want to destroy them, just re-educate them. Friday was the day the ultimatum expired. The atmosphere in the house was as tense as a pulled bowstring. Claire had already left at 6 in the morning for her first shift. Julian was working from home, but I saw he was barely getting anything done. He was waiting for the sales to be confirmed. Around noon, the first notifications came in. The bags were in high demand, the watches too. The money flowed into an account I controlled. It was enough to cover the first payment and even pay down a small portion of the arrears at the bank. I called them both together for a talk that evening. We sat in the living room, which now smelled like me again, lavender and beeswax. You've taken the first step, I said. The house is safe for this month. But that's no reason to relax. We have a long way to go. I laid out a detailed financial plan I had created. It stipulated that 70% of their combined income would go directly toward paying off the debt. They would live only on the essentials. No restaurants, no new clothes, no luxury. Claire looked at the plan. This is like being in prison, she whispered. No, Claire. This is real life, I corrected her. You lived above your means for years. Now you have to pay the price. If you stick to this plan, the house will actually belong to you in 10 years. If not, I'll put it up for auction in the summer and you can see how you like a small rental apartment. Julian nodded immediately. He seemed almost relieved that someone else had taken control. He was never a leader. He had always been a follower. I added one more condition. Tomorrow night, you will host a small gathering. Just the closest friends who were at the party last Saturday. Claire, you will apologize to me in front of them. You will explain that you were out of line and that I am the one saving this house. Claire stiffened. That was the ultimate humiliation for her. But she looked into my eyes and saw that I wouldn't budge. Fine, she said, barely audible. I'll do it. I felt no spite, just a deep satisfaction that order was being restored. Saturday evening. The same group of people who had laughed at me or looked away a week ago were sitting in the living room again. But this time, everything was different. There was no champagne and no catered hors d'oeuvres. There was simple drip coffee and a homemade apple pie. I sat in my armchair by the window. Julian stood nervously beside me, and Claire looked pale but composed. She had worked at the department store all day and for the first time in her life, looked like a woman who knew what hard work meant. Thank you all for coming, Claire began. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept eye contact with her guests. I want to correct something I said last Saturday. I called Eleanor a burden. That was a lie and an insult. The truth is, without Eleanor's financial support and her wisdom, Julian and I would have lost this house long ago. She isn't the one living off us. We are the ones who still have a roof over our heads, thanks to her generosity. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I hope you can forgive me. The room fell into an awkward silence. The guests didn't know how to react. Some looked at the floor in shame, others looked at me with newfound respect. I waited a moment to let the words sink in. Then I gave Claire a brief nod. I accept your apology, Claire. We all make mistakes, but it takes courage to admit them. I think we can move on to the coffee now. The guests began to chat quietly. The atmosphere wasn't festive, but it was honest. After the guests had left, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. The social hierarchy in the house had been corrected. Julian came to me and squeezed my hand. He said nothing, but his eyes were full of gratitude. Claire went silently into the kitchen and started washing the dishes without me having to ask. She had realized that she had to earn her place in this family all over again. I went to my room and slept deeper that night than I had in years. Order was restored without lawyers or police, just through the power of numbers and the strength of character. Weeks passed and a new routine took hold. Claire worked hard at the store. Sometimes I saw her sitting on the stairs in the evening with aching feet, but she didn't complain anymore. She had learned that money has a direct relationship to physical labor. Julian took over all the yard work and house maintenance. They lived modestly on the upper floor, and when they entered my rooms, they did so with a politeness that bordered on reverence. I continued to strictly monitor all expenses, but I noticed myself starting to soften again. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, we sat together in the kitchen. I had made a beef stew, and the scent filled the whole house. Mom Julian said cautiously, "We paid off almost $600 more than planned this month." Claire took on overtime, and I held off on buying those new reference books. I looked at the two of them. They looked tired, but there was a new seriousness in their faces. They weren't spoiled children playing with other people's money anymore. They had become partners in a shared project. "That's very good," I said, setting the plates on the table. "If you keep this up, we can talk about loosening the rules next year. Maybe we can start using the living room together again." A brief smile flickered across Claire's face. It was the first time she didn't see me as an enemy, but as a kind of strict mentor. She had realized that my hardness had saved them from the absolute abyss. We ate together, and for the first time since my husband's death, the table didn't feel empty anymore. I had achieved my goal. I hadn't just secured my money. I had won back my son and grounded my daughter-in-law. There's an old saying, order is half of life. The other half is mutual respect. I had restored both. I knew it would still take years to pay off all the debt, but the foundation was now stable. I was no longer a burden. I was the foundation of this house, and no one would ever dare to claim otherwise again. 6 months later. It was a glorious spring day, and the first buds of my roses were opening. I sat on the patio and watched Julian mow the lawn. Claire came out of the house with a basket of fresh laundry. She wore simple clothes. She had sold almost all of her expensive designer pieces to pay down the debt faster. She looked healthier, more alive. The constant hunt for the next status symbol had fallen off her like an old, tight skin. She looked at me and gave me a friendly nod. It wasn't a submissive nod, but one of equals. I pulled out my little black notebook where I kept track of the payments. The numbers looked good. We had turned the corner. I had recently transferred the house deeds back into Julian's name, but with a lifetime right of residency for me and a clause that gave me immediate control rights in the event of any payment default. He had signed it without hesitation. He trusted me blindly now because he saw that my decisions were always for the good of the family, even when they seemed painful. "Would you like a coffee?" Eleanor Claire asked once she'd hung out the laundry. "I'd love one, Claire," I replied. A little later, we sat together in the sun. We didn't talk about money or debt. We talked about the garden and the neighbors. It was a normal, unspectacular conversation, exactly what I had always wanted. I felt truly free for the first time in a long time. free from worry about my future and free from the anger over the disrespect. If anyone were to ask me today if I were a burden, I would only smile. I've shown that age doesn't mean weakness, it means experience and strategic thinking. I repaired my life and the lives of my children with my own hands and my own mind. No shouting, no threats, just the consistent enforcement of my rights. I closed my eyes and enjoyed the warmth of the sun on my face. The house was quiet, the finances were in order, and my place in the world was secure. My name is Eleanor, and I am finally home. They thought Eleanor was the burden in that house. But the moment she stepped back, their entire life began to crumble. She didn't have to scream to prove her worth. She bought up the debt, opened the folder, and let the numbers do the talking. Some people only understand respect when the support they mocked finally disappears.